him that he has spared the time. To, of course, to both to Rathin and to Neelkanth, both of whom worked with me not only closely in the Finance Commission itself, gave me a lot of valuable advice, both of the members of the advisory panel of the Finance Commission, but also earlier, which they know, when I chaired the Fiscal Responsibility Management Committee, Rathin was a key player in that FRBM. And of course, I counted a great deal also Neelkanth's advice. So you have, Yamini, brought together an exceedingly distinguished set of people and being anchored by you. Let me make a few brief observations because I'm going to come back on an interactive thing somewhat later. So let me briefly say that, yes, it is true that we are the 15th Finance Commission, the commission itself having been worked as the interim Finance Commission, is older than the Constitution of India. It was, first one was from 49 to 51 under the chairmanship of C.D. Deshmukh. And thereafter, under K.C. Niyogi, this is the 15th version or the 15th challenge which the Finance Commission faced. Each Finance Commission have their own challenges. The initial challenges in the initial years were just a divisible pool from out of income tax. Later on, excise got added. Then proportionality of income tax and excise became an amalgam. Then with the 80th Constitutional Amendment in 2000, during the period of Mr. Vajpayee, he brought in the area of enlarging the ingredients of the divisible pool by including every conceivable tax in the divisible pool, including corporate tax, import duty, and so on. But at the same time, it was during that period that another constitutional amendment was made, which kept cess and surcharge out of the divisible pool. So this is where we stood when we came. You mentioned about the trajectory of what happened to earlier finance commissions. If we look at the trajectory, has been an incremental one, where each finance commission has somewhat incrementally increased the total amount of devolution as a percentage of the divisible pool in favor of the states, except the 14th Finance Commission, which in a sense represented a quantum change from 32 to 42, actually to 32.5, because already the 13th Finance Commission had deliberated, but it has been an incremental change. So we had a couple of options before us. We had an option of continuing this trajectory. We had the option of enhancing the devolution of 41 to somewhat higher figure. We had the option of somewhat recalibrating it downwards, looking at the constraints on the fiscal space of the central government. And I think that I have always believed, Yamini, that Finance Commission is not an encounter with shock and awe. The Finance Commission has a legacy which believes in stability, continuity, and predictability. We opted for continuity and predictability. We warded off a lot of other forces which were encouraging the Commission to look in somewhat recalibrating it downwards. We balanced it with what the states would have wanted, a somewhat upward recalibration. By taking all these into account, we felt that fact that already it was at 42, 41%, to leave it on that, which will add a measure of stability and continuity. So this were the factors which played on our mind, including the fact that the fiscal space of the central government had shrunk in the meantime significantly, both for the central government and for the states, on account of the very poor revenue performance, which we all know. And the revenue performance was partly on account of various structural revenue measures which had remained pending and continue to remain pending, and which were somewhat made worse by the fact of the pandemic itself. So with all this, we left it at that. Now, to give you a very broad ballpark number, and I think I'll stop at that and then make just one. So let me give you a ballpark number, which may be in public domain. So there are three important words which Rathin and Neelkanth would know, and all the other distinguished finance ministers and the chief minister, Sangma, would know, that the broadest figure is the GRR, the gross revenue receipts. Now that includes everything. That we calibrated that for a period of our award would be about 153.4 lakh crores based on the modeling which we did. Out of that, you take out the dividends to the Reserve Bank, you take out the user charges, you take out the payments of loans, you come to the next set of figures, which is the GTR, that is the gross tax revenue, which got recalibrated to around 135.4 lakh crores for our award period. Out of that, you take out cess and surcharge, not because we wanted to take it out, but because the Constitution has taken it out. And I'll talk about it a little more on this a little later. So we got a divisible pool out of this from 135.4 lakh crores to 103 lakh crores. And out of this 103 lakh crores, the 41% represented about 42 lakh crore. Add to it the grants, so of 10 lakh crores, 2.95 by way of revenue deficit grants, over 4 lakh crores for the local bodies, for disaster management, and some others. So the first three, which were the main ones the central government has accepted, others remain under their consideration. And I can understand that current year, the fiscal straits, they had an option of rejecting it, but they have kept it under consideration. But they are much smaller amounts, because the big amount is the 4.26 lakh crores for the third tier. There is a big amount on the disaster management of 1.22 lakh crores. And there's a big amount on the revenue deficit grants of 2.95 lakh crores. So when you look at that, what really remains under consideration is somewhat just over 1 lakh crores or so, both by way of sector specific and by way of state specific. So if you add that 10 lakh crores, and without reckoning for the fact that the central government makes a contribution of 3.5 lakh crores for the centrally sponsored schemes, which goes to the states, I'm not reckoning for that. It looked to us on the overall balance of things that it was a fair, appropriate balance between the center and the states. The issue of the cess and surcharge is a separate one on which we can have another sort of question answer. But then having got to this 103 lakh crores, how did we end up in dividing it between the states? And there also we opted by and large for continuity and stability, except with the two important differences which we made. The first difference, we recognized that the fact that the president had instructed the commission to use for the first time the population data of 2011. This, Yamini, had remained constant from the Sixth Finance Commission, which dealt with from between 1974 to 1979. It had kept it constant for 40 years based on the 1971 census data. It was a quantum change that for the first time, and for good reasons, we were asked by the president to use the 2011 census data. Now, if we had done nothing about it, then the concerns of some of the states who have done better demographic management, invested in girl-child education, in health, in other forms of improvement in demographic outcomes, would have been sort of, say, penalized or would have suffered. They felt penalized. We took the view, a neutral word, like the fact that we would have suffered. So we introduced for the first time a new criteria, a criteria of demographic management, to which we assigned a weightage of 12.5%. We also reintroduced another criteria of fiscal efforts and assigned a weightage of 2.5%. So in a sense, the horizontal distribution is divided into three baskets. The first basket being the basket of needs. Needs were represented by population, geographical area, and forest cover. The second broad area was the area of equity, where we assigned a weightage of 45% to equity. In the past, higher percentage have been given, but you felt that we had to balance it out. So 45% out of 100 is not a small weightage to give. And third basket, which we used, was efficiency and performance, where demographic performance got a weightage of 12.5%, and fiscal efforts got a weightage of 2.5%, adding up to. We changed also, taking into account, which Conrad would know better than anyone, that the assignment or weightage to the forest cover, taking into account the problems of the Northeast and the two hill states of Himachal and Uttarakhand, we changed it from 7.5%, which was earlier, to 10% for forest cover. So I thought that we have arrived at a fair amount of symmetry between needs, between equity, and in performance. So that was the basis of the horizontal formula. We recognize the fact that some states may still need support because of the change in the data to 2011 on census. And we calibrated and recalibrated their inescapable revenue expenditure with the likely revenue outcomes. And the continuation, which are not mandatory of Article 275 of the Constitution by way of revenue deficit grants, have substantially gone to states which have also done better demographic management by way of 2.94 lakh crores. So in the overall scheme of things, one more comment and I'll end there. On the third tier, you know very well, Yamini, that under the Constitution, the Finance Commission is not strictly obliged to assign any resources. All that it is expected to do is to suggest the ways in which the consolidated fund of the state can be augmented based on the recommendations of the State Finance Commission to meet the financial needs of the third tier. Unfortunately, that has not happened. State Finance Commissions have not been very active. So we felt that it would be a shock and awe, which we wanted to avoid in every respect if we discontinued the practice. We not only continued the practice, but we substantially enhanced the resources available to the third tier. Of course, we introduced some performance criteria, some entry conditions, obvious ones, audited accounts being put on the common platform and made accountable for, the constitution of the State Finance Commission after a terminal date, and to make the third tier somewhat more self-sustaining and less dependent on the Finance Commission of the central government property tax. We introduced these as entry conditions. We're also looking at the current pandemic. Out of the resources assigned to the third tier, 70,000 crores were assigned for the health infrastructure, particularly primary health centers, district hospitals, and so on and so forth. And then in terms of other needs, sanitation, drainage, drinking water, which are high national priorities. Of course, in all this, a very large segment of untied resources are also continue to be available to them for performing the traditional functions which the third tier has performed in terms of the needs for the panchayat and the urban local bodies. I'll stop here to say that what we have done, we have opted for stability, continuity, and predictability. We have moved away from the lure of a shock and awe. I'll stop here, Yamini.
Thank you very much, Dr. Singh. You've laid out both the key recommendations of the Commission and also the principles that guided those recommendations: stability, predictability, continuity, balancing needs and equity, performance being a critical element of how the grants in particular, but also vertical devolution was formulae were designed, have been at the center of the recommendations of the Finance Commission. Let me start by requesting Honorable Conrad Sangma ji to come in to give us the state perspective. We have a sense of the principles and the basis on which the Finance Commission, 15th Finance Commission recommendations were presented. How have states viewed this? And also consistently, both states have always sort of pushed for 50-50. As Dr. Singh said, there's been an incremental shift in how finance commissions have viewed the vertical devolution, moving in the direction of greater devolution to states. But there's always also been the central pull that comes through the centrally sponsored schemes, and in the Northeast in particular have a special relationship vis-a-vis the union government in terms of how the federal arrangement has been determined. So your views on that as well will be very helpful to all of us. Over to you.
Thank you, Yamini, and a very good morning to all the panelists who are here today, especially to Dr. N.K. Singh ji and Sushil Modi ji, and our finance minister from Andhra, Mr. Reddy ji, and all the other panelists who have joined us. Thank you so much, Yamini, for having invited me. As I had mentioned in the beginning, before we started, that it's always a pleasure to meet and discuss and hear Dr. N.K. Singh, whether it's offline or online. So it's a great opportunity once again, and I thank CPR for taking this initiative. Having said that, Dr. N.K. Singh has really laid down the entire process in which the Finance Commission has worked. And what he had mentioned in his opening remarks, the balance is something that has really been worked and kept at the forefront of how the 15th Finance Commission has worked. And we need to realize that in this entire backdrop of the difficult financial situation that the country was facing, on top of that, the COVID situation that came in, this entire exercise was very, very difficult from the Finance Commission's point of view. But I must say that everything happens for a reason. And that is why we had a chairperson like Dr. N.K. Singh, who is a person who understands, of course, he understands finance, but he's a person who understands the state's perspective. He's a person who understands the central perspectives. He is a person who also understands the regional diversity that the nation has. And keeping all these different diversities and factors and the experience that he had, he's really come up with something that has been a very balanced approach, I should say. And there are many factors in that. I remember last time when we were in Uttarakhand, and there was a special program being organized by the Uttarakhand government. And this was to focus on the hill states of the country, realizing that the hill states face different challenges compared to other states. And Dr. N.K. Singh was, he made a point that he was present in that conference. The Honorable Finance Minister was present in that conference. And that itself indicated on their concern for these states and the fact that they realized that these states do need special attention. All states need special attention, but there's a special attention required by the hill states because of the challenges we face and because of the geographical conditions out here. So these aspects, reflected on the way, the environment aspects were considered. The forest cover percentage weightage was increased from 7.5 to 10%. So that really helped us to really overcome a large amount of the challenges that which we faced. Also, I think the fact that the fiscal efforts of the state were given a lot of stress on, that itself also is another factor where at least government of Meghalaya is working very hard on. We happen to be a state which has some revenue sources, unlike many of the other Northeast states. But this incentive is pushing us now to ensure that we work towards increasing our own revenues at the state level. Also, if you look at the grants that were given to the different third tier, in the 14th Finance Commission, we saw that the district councils, for example, did not get any devolution at that point in time. And that is the district councils are kind of a third tier for a state like Meghalaya and many other states in the Northeast. But in this Finance Commission, Dr. N.K. Singh understood the dynamics and the kind of need at the grassroots level. And almost more than 700 crores, about 711 crores, if I'm not wrong, was sanctioned for the autonomous district councils in the state of Meghalaya. So these kind of considerations at the micro level have indicated how this Finance Commission has worked towards ensuring that all these aspects and the diversity and the complexity of the region for this for Meghalaya and the region of the Northeast have been looked into. I would also like to just say at this point in time that we need to ensure in this pandemic that the government spending has to go up. And therefore, another very positive step, which I strongly feel, is that the fact that allowing the state governments to have their fiscal deficit up from 3% to 4% will also go a long way in ensuring that our government spending goes up. And that's one of the important ways in which we can come out of this economic kind of challenge that we're facing because of COVID. So I think these aspects in micro, if you look at them, many things are there that will help the states. Of course, many people will talk about different aspects. Every state will have its own challenges. Every state will have its own opinion. But overall, given the difficult time, I think the 15th Finance Commission under the chairmanship of Dr. N.K. Singh has really done a tremendous job. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank him and the entire 15th Finance Commission for this beautiful report and the beautiful recommendation that has been given by them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sangma ji. May I now request Sushil Modi ji to offer his remarks, and in particular also weighing in on this question of the dynamics between center and state, particularly in the context of both the structural changes that India experienced that predate the Finance Commission, and how you see the Finance Commission responding to those structural changes, GST, the dismantling of the Planning Commission, and so on.
Good morning to everybody. Namaskar, Dr. N.K. Singh ji, Sangma ji, B. Rajendranath Reddy ji, Dr. Rathin Roy, Neelkanth Mishra ji, and of course, Yamini Aiyar ji. And thanks for organizing this webinar, because you were, for the last many days, we are making effort to make this webinar a success. First of all, I must thank Sri N.K. Singh ji, because he has been very principled and pragmatic in providing this with this report. It was a very difficult task, because first the interim report of 2021, at that time also there was an economic slowdown, and the revenue from the GST were also not what was required. So in that difficult situation, he had to give an interim report. And again, we all were struck with the pandemic. So I think in the last 60 or 70 years, this Finance Commission has been facing the most difficult task to provide of this kind of a report. And I must thank Mr. N.K. Singh ji for to keeping a balance between the need, efficiency, and equity. And he's also taken a judicious approach in weighing competing needs of the center and the states. So first of all, I thank Sri N.K. Singh ji and his entire team for giving us of this kind of a report. Already N.K. Singh ji has also mentioned, and Mr. Sangma has also mentioned, that there are unique features of this Finance Commission report. And I would just like to mention some of the features. Number one is regarding 8,000 crore has been provided for the first time for incubation of 8 new cities. And for the first time, the urban local bodies and the Panchayati Raj institutions have been provided with 70,000 crore for grant for health infrastructure. Earlier, whatever revenue was provided, it was provided to the state governments. But for the first time, the local bodies have been entrusted with looking after the infrastructure, and 70,000 crore has been provided to these bodies. And in the same way, but one of the recommendation that is regarding disaster. So there is a recommendation that 10 to 25% of graded cost sharing basis by the states for NDRF and NDMF. This particular recommendation has not been appreciated by the states because now they will have to bear the 10 to 25% of the cost, whatever grants they get from NDRF and NDMF. But overall, we all are happy with the recommendations of the 15th Finance Commission. But I would like to mention some more points. Number one, regarding the vertical, the horizontal distribution, because I've seen that there are about 3, 4, 5, 6, there are about 8 states whose share has shrinked in comparison to 14th Finance Commission, like Andhra Pradesh, Assam, Haryana, Karnataka, Kerala, Odisha, Telangana, and UP. So these are the 8 states whose share in the central taxes has shrinked, though it is not very major, only if we consider Karnataka, whose share is shrink to about 1.067%. But these are the 8 states which will suffer because of the shrinking in their state share in the union taxes. And surprisingly, Maharashtra has got the maximum increase 0.614%. लेकिन आप कोई भी formula बनाएंगे, you make any formula, it is very difficult to satisfy all the states in the union government. But I can say that this is the first Finance Commission. I've not heard a single note of dissent from any states. Otherwise, we were expecting that, especially the southern states, they will make a note of dissent. But surprisingly, each and every state has appreciated the recommendations given by this 15th Finance Commission chaired by Mr. N.K. Singh. So this is what it was a very difficult task, very Herculean task, but you've been able to satisfy most of the states. Now, Mr. N.K. Singh, I would like to raise 3 or 4 issues. One regarding the divisive pool, because the share of divisive pool is slowly shrinking. And already you have mentioned in your report that in the year 11-12, as a percentage of gross tax revenue, the total cesses and surcharges were 10.4%, and which have now been increased to 20.2%. And if you deduct GST compensation, then still it is 15.7%. So one of the issue which the states are always raising, and I know that this is not in the domain of the Finance Commission, because under the Constitution, cess and surcharge are not part of the divisive pool. But slowly and slowly, the divisive pool size is shrinking, and the cess and surcharge is increasing. So what is the way out? And we also know that the union government also require money, they also require revenue. But this is one issue. Number 2, regarding state-specific and sector-specific grant, though the amount is not very big, but if you combine the sector-specific grant and state-specific grant, it comes to about 1,79,000 crore, which is about 17.39% of the entire grants. Though central government has not rejected these 2 proposals, but that is under consideration. Mr. N.K. Singh should advise us what the state should do, because though the amount is not very big, but sector-specific and state-specific grants are 17.39%. Then number 3, regarding revenue deficit grant, because according to the terms of reference, the Commission may also examine whether revenue deficit grant be provided at all. And Finance Commission has recommended a 2,95,000 crore of revenue deficit grants. And I was just looking at the states which are getting the revenue deficit grants. I can understand the 7 northeastern states, Assam, Manipur, Meghalaya, Mizoram, Nagaland, Sikkim, Tripura, they are getting 58,000 crore as a revenue deficit grant. But I should not name any state, but still I have to name because the state like Punjab, West Bengal, these two states alone will be getting 66,000 crore as a revenue deficit grant. And Andhra Pradesh, we can also understand Andhra Pradesh because after bifurcation of Andhra Pradesh and Telangana, Andhra Pradesh is suffering because of the division because of bifurcation. So Andhra Pradesh is getting 30,497 crore. But Kerala is getting 37,000 crore. Tamil Nadu is getting, though Tamil Nadu is getting very bigger amount, only 2,204 amount. So this revenue deficit grant and Mr. N.K. Singh ji, if we, I was analyzing the entire grant. So the 12 states will be getting 54, 12 states will be, 17 states will be getting 82% of the total grants. 82% of the total grants, 17 states will be getting. And 12 states, which includes Bihar, Odisha, Uttar Pradesh, they will be getting only 54% of the total grants. Because the local government grant and the disaster management grant, it is 54% of the total grant. So Bihar will be getting only local government grant and disaster management grant. So about 12 states will be getting only local government grant and disaster management grant. Will be not be getting revenue deficit grant. And because already state and state specific and sector specific grant is under consideration of the government of India. So states like UP, Bihar, Odisha, they will be deprived about 50% of the grants which could have given to states like Bihar and other states in the normal course. So this is also one issue which I wanted to raise before Mr. N.K. Singh ji and other panelists. And regarding demographic effort, and I really appreciate because the southern states and some other states also, they made good effort in the last 40, 50 years. And because of some historical background also, it is not only the effort of the state governments, those state governments have made their efforts. Because of the historical background, because of the old legacies, states like Kerala, Tamil Nadu, and other states. I was going through one report that during the Maharaja Travancore in the earlier 30s, he used to spend 25% of his budget for education. So it is not only the present government. About 80, 90 years back, even the Maharaja was spending 25% of the budget for education. And that's why they are reaping the benefit of those efforts which started 70, 80 years back. So once again, Mr. N.K. Singh ji and other panelists, I've raised some pertinent issues, which states, I know that nobody can give answer to all these issues, but if Mr. N.K. Singh ji can advise us what the state should do and what was the necessity of providing such a huge amount as a revenue deficit grant. और मैं एक चीज और देख रहा था कि like Odisha, their state share is decreased. Odisha, Telangana, and UP. Odisha by 0.013%, Telangana by 0.304%, and UP by 0.208%. And they are not getting a revenue deficit grant also. So though we have a feeling in Bihar, because we governed better, we were revenue surplus state. So that's why we have suffered, we have been deprived any such grant like a revenue deficit grant. So those states who could not manage their finances, who took a huge loan, who they are getting revenue deficit grants, and the states, those who manage their finances well, they have been deprived of any such grants. लेकिन कुल मिलाकर मैं एनके सिंह जी को धन्यवाद देना चाहूंगा कि आपने इस पेंडेमिक के काल में जितनी बेहतरीन रिपोर्ट दी है कि इतिहास हमेशा आपको भी याद रखेगा और आपकी इस कमेटी और इस एफर्ट को भी और याद रखेगा. धन्यवाद.
Thank you, Bodhiji. You've raised some very, very important, pertinent questions. Dr. Singh, if I can request you to just hold on, we'll request Honorable Andhra Pradesh Finance Minister Reddy ji to offer his remarks, and then we can respond to all together. Reddy ji, over to you. Just, I think very important issues have been raised. One more question I wanted to throw to you to hear your views on, particularly on the state and sector grants, as well as the urban local bodies grants. Performance criteria are now firmly embedded in how the Finance Commission's recommendations have been presented. What is the state's perspective on this? How does this performance grant mean that we'll again end up in a tension of rewarding better governed states, and those that actually need it may not get it? Is this going to create new entry criteria and create inequities? Just to hear state perspectives on this shift that has been again incremental in previous finance commissions, but I think a little bit more pronounced in this one. Over to you, sir. So I think you're mute.
Yeah. Good morning, ma'am, Yamini, and team members of the CPR. And a very good morning to Shri Dr. N.K. Singh sir, and Shri Sushil Kumar Modi ji, Shri Conrad Sangma ji, and Dr. Rathin, Neelkanth, Mishra, and everyone else participating in this webinar. First, I would like to congratulate Dr. N.K. Singh sir and the team members of the 15th Finance Commission in presenting a report that is not only appreciated but very well received in this country amongst all the states that I have come to know and got feedback from. And the way in which Dr. N.K. Singh sir has explained that stability, continuity, and predictability, these are the three ways in which the report was actually founded upon. And the vast experience that Dr. Singh sir has in the areas of bureaucracy as well as public life, and also by way of interacting with people with a wide range of from the smallest to the biggest, has actually, I think, resulted in this report that is, of course, supported by the other team members of the Finance Commission. However, when I go back to a year ago, that was when 37th GST Council meeting was held in Goa, when Dr. N.K. Singh sir actually had brought about the issue of slowdown in the economy. Most of the finance ministers who attended that council meeting were actually surprised that the major portion of the GST Council meeting was actually taken by the 15th Finance Commission. Subsequently, just a couple of months later, we realized the importance and the intensity which actually prompted this. Just a couple of months later, I had the opportunity to meet Dr. N.K. Singh sir in Delhi, when he expressed a lot of fear about how the COVID pandemic is going to take shape. Those were the months and the days when a lot of people did not really understand what was happening, not only in the world, but also in the country. A few months later, when I got an opportunity to once again speak to him over the phone, I actually was overwhelmed and asked him, sir, how did you get this information so much in advance? Because the way in which the world moved after that, we all know. So during those periods, one thing that is very appreciable is the way in which an interim report was actually presented. That was a very thoughtful way of handling the presentation of the report. The interim report itself, I think, gave the gap in which the assessment could actually be made. So this, we really have to appreciate Dr. N.K. Singh's forethought and administrative skills. And also, after the interim report, when the main report has come, the different new allocations that have been made or the grants that have been given. So for example, when, just like how Dr. N.K. Singh sir had mentioned in his, in his initial word, when the 2011 census was taken, most of the states, southern states especially, who had, which had taken population control well, were actually a little apprehensive about the way in which the horizontal devolution is going to be made. But the addition of demographic management of 12.5% and 2.5% of the fiscal efforts that were made was very well thought of, and this actually gave the balance. Now, these things we can actually notice in the form of a person or a team that is very well aware of the country, from the bottommost level to the topmost level, who can understand the various ways in which governance actually happens. So this is very well received. And then the various ways in which different grants were made. Now, for example, when we go to the sector-specific grants, the sector-specific grants, when I went through the report, I was amazed at the amount of research that was done in getting to the grants being defined and the various sectors that were studied. When we go to agriculture and farmers welfare, similarly, when we go to the Department of Rural Development and Drinking Water, and similarly, when we go to even the minutest things like Statistics Department, like law, courts, like commerce, and different sectors which grants were given. Here we can notice it is not just about the money that is given, but it is the way in which these sectors have been highlighted. Now, for example, the grant that has been given in the sector towards online classes to, in fact, make the Matribhasha more relevant in higher education. That's very well thought of. This is not something that normally comes in the way of a Finance Commission report, or for that matter, any sort of report or any way in which governance happens. So these are very important, I feel, for future generations to come. And then the local body grants too. The local bodies, if we notice, they're actually starved of funds. There's not much of support, like Dr. Singh sir said in the beginning, from the state government. So this is the money that actually comes, that is actually some sort of oxygen to the functioning of local bodies. And now to answer to Ms. Yamini's question of the performance criteria, I think it is very necessary. Because here, if we notice, the grant has been divided into two portions. Part of it comes directly, part of it is performance oriented. Unless there is a performance orientation, very few people would want to actually take up certain measures that are inevitable for the future. For example, house tax collection, property tax. Very few minor gram panchayats in this country have house tax collection. It is only a few major gram panchayats and the urban local bodies that are doing collection, and the framing of a base rate from which the property tax can actually be started to be collected. That is also very important. So this, I think, is necessary. And then going forward, the way in which my colleague, Mr. Sushil Modiji has said, regarding the RD grant, he actually said that it is understandable that Andhra Pradesh got the RD grant in view of the bifurcation that is taking place. So this I appreciate and thank him for having the true federal spirit that is very much required in the country today. And similarly, like Mr. Conrad Sangma has said, it is, I think, the vast experience that Dr. N.K. Singh sir had in his long and very well appreciated career that actually resulted in this report, as well as the high-powered committee that has been recommended in the end. That also is, I think, very necessary for two aspects. One is looking once again into the FRBM Act, as well as any modifications to the FRBM Act and the compliance of the FRBM Act, as well as one of the things is the spending and the administration of the state-specific and sector-specific grants that have been given by the 15th Finance Commission. On the whole, sir, I once again thank everybody, and I thank Dr. N.K. Singh sir on behalf of the state of Andhra Pradesh for being very kind to the state in view of the bifurcation that has taken place in 2014. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Singh, over to you to respond to some of the questions. I know Sangma ji has to leave soon, so if there's anything that you would like to add, please feel free.
I think there's already a lot on the table. Mr. Sushil Kumar Modi ji has put in a lot of points, and Mr. Reddy also has put in a lot of points. Dr. N.K. Singh sir is, I'm sure he'll be able to answer all those questions. But of course, I would also be very keen to listen to Dr. N.K. Singh's view, especially when it comes to the cess part, which you had said in the beginning that you would discuss at a later point. So maybe I would not complicate things too much, but once again, thank Yamini and Dr. N.K. Singh and everybody for giving me this opportunity to be here. I will stick around for some more time because I really want to hear what Dr. N.K. Singh has to say. So over to you, Yamini. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Singh.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, first of all, my profound gratitude to Conrad Sangma, the distinguished Chief Minister of Meghalaya, to Sushil Modi ji, and also to Mr. Reddy for his generous words and the appreciation of the dynamics through which the difficult period the Finance Commission was able to discharge its constitutional obligation and addressing, which you all know, terms of reference which in some ways were unique because perhaps no other commission had so many components in the terms of reference, and each box had to be ticked off. So I'm deeply grateful on behalf of my commission for the very generous words which all the panelists and the honorable ministers and the chief minister has said. Let me begin with that. Couple of very pointed questions. I could perceive that there are four. One on the issue of cess and surcharge, raised by Sushil Modi ji. The second on the state and sector-specific grants. Third, on the modalities for the distribution of the revenue deficit grants. And fourth, on the performance criteria imposed on the third tier resources this year. I could perceive there are four questions which are addressed to me. So first, let me talk about the cess and surcharge. Now, all of you know that prior to the 80th constitutional amendment, cess and surcharge were not specifically debarred from the ambit of any finance commission. It is another matter that no finance commission chose earlier than this to include cess and surcharge, even without the impediment created by the 80th constitutional amendment. So there is no doubt that the incidence of cess and surcharge as a percentage of the divisible pool, that is the GTR, has gone up in 2010-11 from around 10% to now around 19.9% in the BE of 2021. This is virtually doubling. And I'm glad that Sushil Modi ji has reckoned that out of this, of course, the compensation cess is included, and which goes entirely to the states. So if you take that out, it is still an increase from around 10 to 16. And let me say that it requires, Sushil Modi ji and others raise the issue, what do we do? And what can we do? I think, in my view, this requires a much greater, wider debate, consensus building among domain experts, and a wider convergence of views in policymakers, and for Parliament to amend, therefore, this constitutional provision. Without a constitutional amendment, there is no way that the Finance Commission can address this particular disability. Some members have, writing, raised the issue of whether or not this commission took adequate note of this. Well, I don't want to go into the quality of the poetry written by earlier finance commissions, but I draw the attention to paragraph 3.63, paragraph 3.8, paragraph 4.25, and paragraph 4.26 of the Commission's report, that there is recognition of the growing incidence of cess and surcharge, and in a manner where this has not found the Commission's appreciation. But instead of adding to idle poetry, we have done what was necessary. We have recalibrated the likely cess and surcharge and frozen it at 18.4 in a downward direction for the period of our award. This is all that this was the only course available to us. Because by writing more poetry on it, we would only be saying that the policymakers should consider a constitutional amendment. Also, I entirely agree with the point made by Sushilji that it should not be anybody's intention that whatever be the increase in the devolution to states is neutralized, if not undercut, by a rising percentage of cess and surcharge. It cannot be that we give from one hand and from the other hand, this is recalibrated by increased incidence of cess and surcharge. But the path forward is wider consensus among policymakers and for changes to be brought about in this constitutional amendment, which was introduced in 2000 by the 80th Amendment. Prior to that, there was greater flexibility. So I'll stop unless you wanted to say.
No, I just going to say with Neelkanth, with Mr. Mishra and Dr. Roy, we'll come back to this question on the cesses in particular. So,
okay. So
just wanted to say that. So shall we?
Yeah, the second issue which was raised was he wanted a way out. I have suggested a way out. What about sector and state specific grants, which he has rightly calculated? Trust Sushilji to do his homework with his characteristic due diligence to come to the exact figure that this constitutes not a minuscule but a substantial part of the grant of 17% or so from the overall grants, amounting to 1.79 lakh crores over a period of 5 years. So this is the amount we're talking about. The central government has no doubt not rejected it. Now this has two components. The first component is sector specific. What is the sector specific? The two principal components of the sector specific was the agriculture sector, which has 45,000 crore, and another important sector specific apart from the agricultural sector was the assignment for purposes of the health sector of another 30,000 crore. Health sector would I have given from 70,000 crore for the third year. That remains untouched. On this, there are other things like Dr. Reddy has mentioned on online education, improvement in statistical data, aspirational districts. These are small amounts of money which were to go. But what has been given is that currently, which you all know, that based on the recommendations of the 15th Finance Commission, the character and nature of the centrally sponsored schemes and the central outlays are undergoing very, very important changes. And those changes we should see in the course of this fiscal year. and that many of these sector specific are designed to be subsumed in a larger matrix on which I believe they are working on by way of rationalization. So we'll have to wait and watch for that. That leaves out the 49,000 crore, which I have given to state specific. And Sushilji wanted to know what should the states do. I think that Conrad would agree, he would agree, Dr. Reddy would agree, and others, that the best way is, in my view, that looking at the way in which the fiscal situation spans it out, hopefully, because they have said that in regard to states specific, that these recommendations would be taken and examined very seriously. Hopefully, having made the recommendations, I would certainly hope that these recommendations also find acceptance by way of financial resources being provided. If not in this supplementary, then in terms as we go forward, as I have said somewhat earlier, Yamini, and I want to say that this is not the Finance Commission's report is not a T20 or a one-day match. It's a 5-year award. So if the financial situation and fiscal situation is somewhat more stressed out, there is a huge room still available for the central government, hopefully, to accept the sector, the state-specific grants, since the sector-specific is being discussed in the context of the rationalization of the centrally sponsored schemes. Then the third issue, which was raised very briefly, but with great amount of telling detail, was RDG, the revenue deficit grants by Sushilji. Let me explain, take 2 minutes. You see, if you look at Article 275 of the Constitution, and if what Sushilji very correctly read out is that the hint and the suggestion to the Finance Commission, if you look at the terms of reference, it has ended on the RDG by saying, if at all. There was an implied suggestion that it would be better if we desisted from making this award or making this recommendation. But how did you go about it? This time, unlike in the past, we went very deeply into the finances of each state. And the volume 4 of the Commission's report is entirely devoted to the states. And if you look at the state financial analysis, each state finances have been dissected in great depth. So first of all, we looked at the states very carefully. And then what did we do? We looked at the inescapable revenue expenditure of each of the states, with certain norms being applied on the way in which these revenue expenditure, pension, pay, etc., could be addressed. Then we looked at perhaps what could be the most optimistic scenario from the viewpoint of the revenue buoyancy. And if there was an inescapable, unbridgeable deficit, that we recommended be provided through the revenue deficit grants. So it was entirely based on a formulation. Now, it is true that where Sushilji is right, in the optics of it, if you look at the fact that somebody will ask the question, oh, look at the per capita income of, say, a state like Kerala, as compared to the per capita income of a state like Bihar. Kerala's per capita income is significantly higher than the per capita income of Bihar. And yet Kerala gets a large revenue deficit grant. Bihar and UP do not get a revenue deficit grant. Now, we must understand something which I'm grateful that all the 3 panelists appreciated, that having received the presidential order of using the 2011 census, we tried to mitigate the impact of that by the introduction of the 12.5% weightage to demography. But nonetheless, we felt that in spite of this, there were large gaps which were available in terms of the minimum revenue expenditure which they would have to incur compared to the likely revenues which they were going to realize. And we felt, therefore, that this was one way of addressing the transition for even these states, which may look on the face of it to have a higher per capita income, significantly higher per capita income than some of the poorer states. So that's in the case of Punjab, the issue of legacy debt, which many people know had remained under addressed. There are two other factors. They pleaded that Punjab lost one generation on account of militancy. Current Punjab generation is facing the huge problem of geopolitical insecurities, which are real because our neighbor would look to a situation where the state of Punjab goes into state degree of uncertainty and political instability. It was not an economic factor, but it was an uneconomic factor, which of course has an influence. The geopolitics cannot be just overlooked. The fact that the incidence of large drug has debilitated a working population of Punjab. The fact that these legacy debts of Punjab were incurred on account of the unsettled dispute between the Food Corporation of India's procurement policy and what the Punjab government and others had paid to the farmers. These issues of legacy debt had crawled up rather significantly, apart from the factor that it was based on a normative assessment as well. So there were the methodology which we used were completely transparent. The methodology has been outlined in the report itself. How did we calibrate? The RDG has been laid out in great detail, and we felt that having accepted a normative approach, let me also say that anecdotally, since this is all in the past, we did look at the fiscal constraints of the central government on a mechanical basis. On a mechanical basis, if what we gave in our interim report by way of the revenue deficit grant was to be multiplied, then it would have been significantly higher than, or somewhat higher than the 2.94 lakh crores, which we capped because we looked at the other factors in the fiscal pressures. So there has been a well thought out approach by way of the way in which we have gone about the revenue deficit grant. The third and the last point which you mentioned was, by the way, the third point which you mentioned was about, the last point was a performance criteria we used for grants to the third tier. Let me say one thing. Grants are not a matter of right. Grants are, by way of definition, discretionary. Grants are debited to what is left for the central government from out of the divisible pool. Having fixed the divisible pool at 42%, what is left for the central government, all grants which we give, the cost of that has to be borne out of the vertical. And therefore, the issue of performance criteria, as I told you, we came a long way from the issue of not giving any resources to the third tier at all. I've said so earlier. And I was greatly influenced by what Mr. Sangma said, that not only we increased substantially to the third tier, but that increase had to be some way calibrated to the introduction of performance criteria, even leaving a lot of room for untied grants. And something that Mr. Sangma and his colleagues from the Northeast had pleaded, that a lot of the third tier, which was left out, particularly the hill councils, in the case of Assam, Bodoland and others, have been left out of the 14th Finance Commission, even though they follow the same procedures in respect of the elections. We felt that they should be included, as indeed we have made it an all-inclusive coverage, not only including them, but including the cantonment areas as well, on which the residents of the cantonment area made a strong plea. So in a certain sense, the performance criteria are designed to ensure that these discretionary grants are utilized in consonance with what could be considered national high priorities. After all, what are they? Drinking water, sanitation, drainage, open defecation, treatment of this fecal matter. And some of these entry conditions which you have put are designed, as Dr. Reddy has understood very well, that after the GST, the options for revenue for the third tier had shrunk very dramatically. And the dependence of the third tier on government had become far, far too much. You cannot have genuine independence till you have financial independence. And if the financial dependence was so high, then that was a kind of a situation which was totally inconsistent with the spirit of the 73rd and 74th Constitutional Amendment. And I'll end by saying one last sentence that we felt that property tax was one area which had remained underutilized. There were very few revenue sources open. This could be gainfully used, as indeed other sources. And the fact that these are public resources and they must be audited is no brainer. And the fact that the obligation under the Constitution is for the state finance commissions to undertake the work is no brainer. And so those are some axiomatic entry criteria which we have made, and the performance criteria logic of that I've sought to spell out. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. It's a good time for me to bring in Mr. Neelkanth Mishra for your remarks and also your views, particularly on the fiscal consolidation roadmap going forward. To you.
Thank you, Yamini. Thank you for inviting me. It's such a privilege to be on the same panel as the Honorable Chairman of the 15th Finance Commission, who I've learned a lot from in my associations with Chief Minister Sangma, Mr. Modi, and Finance Minister Reddy, and as well as Rathin, who I think has been a guide and a teacher as well as a brilliant person to bounce ideas off. On the fiscal side, it is important for us to understand that the increase in debt to GDP that we have seen this year for the states as well as the center, it is not going to be possible to shrink into a lower debt to GDP. Right? So if we went from 70% to close to 90% consolidated debt to GDP, it won't be possible for the governments to shrink expenditure and then get down to a lower debt to GDP. One, even if the economy grows at 11 to 12% nominal, I think it will take more than a decade to get back to where we were, and to get to the 60%, I think is now impossible. So I think some of those recalibrations need to happen. The governments in India actually work with very little discretion. 91% of the central government's expenditure is effectively non-discretionary. It's salaries, pensions, defense, the PM Kisan transfers, GST compensation, and so on and so forth. So there is very little that the center can really cut down on in order to bring down its deficit. The only way to do this is what in financial terms we call operating leverage, that you have a very large, high fixed cost base. The only way to generate space above that is to grow. And so I think the priority has to be for growth. One of the things that we discussed, I think, deeply in the advisory council meetings of the Finance Commission is what growth rates should we take for the next 5 to 6 years? Because some of the questions on, for example, the revenue deficit grants, of course, imply a certain or assume a certain growth rate for various states, tax collections, and it is if that growth rate is say 1 to 2% higher every year in nominal GDP terms, and it's already turning out, right? So and the Finance Commission would not have known in October this was going to happen, but the -6% for FY21 is most likely going to be -3%. The plus 13.5% for FY22. The center itself has taken plus 15.5%, and I think it can be actually quite a bit higher. So But just in these 2 years, there's already a 5 to 6% gap. And there's no way the Finance Commission could have seen this coming. It was a terrible year to put out a 5-year forecast. But I do think that the growth numbers, I think, can be higher, and perhaps that will afford more fiscal space. So instead of just figuring out how to divide this, perhaps in forecast we need to discuss that. A slightly more important issue is, I think, a structure of the borrowing market, in the sense that despite the drop in inflation, despite the drop in repo rates, the RBI said repo rates, the cost of borrowing has not come down. You must have read that state governments are now borrowing at a higher cost than home buyers, right? So the home buying rates are around 6.7. Many states are borrowing at 7% plus. Of course, these are very different loans. In one case, there is a collateral available and all that, but the states are effectively the sovereign, and effectively the sovereign, and they are not, and they should not be the sovereign. But the point is that the bond market is not functioning properly, and I think the fact that the increase in fiscal deficit this year, the increase in debt this year was all financed at a very high rate of interest, is something that is going to stick with the states and the center. And therefore, as we recalibrate our fiscal targets, we need to be very aware that the interest cost burden itself is, as a percentage of GDP, is going to be significantly higher going forward. Last point, and then I realize running out of time, I think we should get Rathin's views as well, that tax to GDP in India has been stagnant, right? So the Finance Commission does point out that the revenue neutral rate was a lot higher than what it is, the GST is at right now. But there is still, I mean, even if you adjust for that, we are far, far below where OECD is, right? So the early 30s as a percentage of GDP, we're at 17 to 18%, and we are stuck there despite the high excise duty on fuel. There is a problem with formality. We all know the issues, but I think it is important to be a lot more creative. Just to give you an example, if you go and read about why the local school system, the district school system, county school system in the US is locally funded, it was because in the 1830s, 40s, when that whole system was being set up, the center had no money. The center in the US that time only had money to run the post office, and they had to somehow fund the school system. So they allowed the counties and the districts to tax. And that's where, the enforcement of property tax, etc. So I think we need to see some more creativity. If you see the history of China as well, there is a continuous pull and push that the center first demands more, forces the second and third tier governments to be a lot more creative in tax generation. But this is not something that we have seen happening in India. Some states have been a bit more creative, but I think generally it is, even GST, right? I mean, why did the GST Council agree to cost cuts or the rate cuts? It was because they had 5 years of confirmed revenues. So I think we need to see give more responsibility to the states and maybe in the third tier governments to generate more revenues, because at 18% tax to GDP, we will be counting pennies and dividing what actually is a very small pie. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Neelkanth. Dr. Roy, over to you. Also, your views on the path to fiscal consolidation, but also specifically, I think Dr. Singh raised an important issue about the need for greater, wider public debate and debate amongst experts on the issue of cess and surcharges and what that does to the dynamics of fiscal federalism. So your thoughts on that as well. I thought it'd be nice to use this as an opportunity, and I'd request others to come in also after Dr. Roy to perhaps even kickstart that debate, drawing on the provocations. So over to you.
Okay, so let me start by saying that I think I really want to, I was the chief economist of the 13th Finance Commission. And I have to say with some chagrin that I think the quality of the analysis in this report beats mine. It's an extremely well-analyzed report. And believe me, I've been through it with a fine-tooth comb, trying to sort of nitpick on the technique. The technique is flawless. More than that, I think, as Dr. Singh said, but he was too polite to say what I now as a public intellectual can say. it has navigated, I think, an extremely retrograde, patronizing terms of reference, which could not possibly have been written by anybody who spent a day working in a state government as opposed to a union territory. It was asymmetric in terms of its expectations about what the states do with their money versus the center. To accuse the states of being populist and profligate in the face of evidence of at least the last 15 years relative to a responsible center is absurd. It asked the Finance Commission to go into all sorts of strange areas, in a sense with an abdication of responsibility from the government of India, such as defense spending and how to solve the problem, which I thought was most unfortunate. And having spent a lot of time on the FRBM, it sort of abdicated its own responsibility to deal with that issue to the Finance Commission. So the Finance Commission was faced with a very difficult task. Add to that COVID and the structural slowdown that the country has been for some years. I cannot think of a report that could have addressed this situation. I would not have expected anything more from a commission report that has addressed the situation rather superbly. Dr. Singh spoke of poetry. I congratulate you on your poetry on defense. I also congratulate you on your gentle exhortations to the central government to get serious about fiscal responsibility, taking on board implicitly, I think, and I can say that, the fact that they have not done so, at least since Mr. Jaswant Singh and Mr. Yashwant Sinha were finance ministers. It's a long time. So I think overall it's an excellent report. Now, I have 4 or 5 points to raise, more in the form of debate. The first is the question of poetry. So where I very respectfully disagree with Dr. Singh is on the cess issue in terms of what the commission could have done. Why do I say that? The commission has actually written poetry in the 4 paragraphs that Dr. Singh has mentioned. It could have written some prose. And to look at what prose it could have written, you only have to look at what they have done with the FRBM, which I'll come to in a minute. You could have calibrated the vertical devolution to the cess number. I think the commission stipulating that the cesses will freeze or fall is not enforceable. If they in effect rise further as they have for the past 10 years, then in effect the vertical devolution will be even lower than it is now. And I think it was possible to counteract that by, since we have gone into the business of ranges, by specifying a vertical devolution range. Now, let me hasten to add that I'm being a little naughty here. I do not think this would have found favor to me if I was actually a member of a finance commission. But since I'm in the position of not being a member of the Finance Commission, let me just point out a technical matter, that it was possible in theory for the commission to address the issue of cesses, to open the debate as Yamini described. Perhaps the commission could not as a constitutional body, I don't know why, but maybe we should. What that probably means is that the focus of analysis very sharply every year has to be on the extent to which the commission's vertical devolution decision has been, in a sense, defenestrated as cesses rise. I think that's very important. Okay, that is one. I want to go to the FRBM. I think the FRBM was very modest in its scope and therefore very honest. Because underlying the FRBM and the rest of what I'm going to say is a very serious situation, which I keep on pointing out, but for some reason nobody picks up on. The size of the central government today as a percentage of total central spending on GDP is smaller than it was in 1992 by a whole 4 percentage points. You have a shrinking central government. At the same time, you have a central government which has, and I don't blame the government for a minute, any government, taken on responsibilities in areas that are not its core mandate. Because if Prime Minister Manmohan Singh or Prime Minister Narendra Modi were to go to the electorate and say, look, I've managed your defense expenditure well, here's some money for the railways, I've done foreign affairs, now vote me back to power. The people of India would not, because they expect more. So what do you expect the center to do? There is only so much the center can do. As I once told the late Arun Jaitley ji in 2016, I said, in Hindi, forgive me, I said, आपने बातें तो बड़ी अच्छी की, आपने पैसा नहीं खर्चा किया, इसलिए मैं बहुत धन्यवाद आपको प्रकट करता हूँ. So there is a lot of talk you can do, and I have criticized this talk, but there's very little else the center can do. By virtue of the fact that what Neelkanth mentioned, I think, is a matter of the second debate. Our tax GDP ratio today is exactly the same as it was in 1992.
which means whoever else has benefited from liberalization and growth, it has not been the governments of India. That's a very important structural issue. And as an economist, I think it's very important that these should be the cornerstones of economic analysis going forward. And obviously the Finance Commission couldn't do that. It would alarm people, I can do it. And they didn't, but there are enough hints in the FRBM chapter that this needs to be taken seriously. And therefore, you would expect to see the central government scrambling for cess, you know, much like a poor neighbor who sits outside your door trying to grab, you know, crusts when they can. They would do it. Also, they have asymmetric power to do it, and they would do it. Remember also that one of the major increases in the central government spending, I discovered this in the Pay Commission, has not been so much things like Narega. If you actually look at personnel and establishment, the only ministry of the central government to have increased its expenditure is the Ministry of Home Affairs. And in that, the largest expenditure has come in paramilitary, which is why, as I've said in public yesterday, the Home Affairs Ministry is very efficient. But that's not a very desirable state of affairs for a state that aspires to a development transformation. And I think this is the third item we have to debate, which is what are the drivers of a shrinking central government and a central government whose incremental spending is increasingly non-developmental and therefore scrambles for money at the margin to fulfill the electoral obligations very unfairly that we, the people of India, impose on it. And to some extent, I must blame the state governments as well, because they look to the center when they wish to increase spending rather than, you know, do otherwise. The third pillar of economic analysis, which was actually absent in this commission's report, and I think that is unfortunate, but that is not, not been present in any commission's report. But going forward, I think we have to take cognizance of this. And this is very important for the Northeast, for the east of India, and for Northern India, excluding the NCR. So I trust at least 2 of the 3 chief finance ministers here would find this interesting. There is a consistent transfer of labor and capital that has been happening since liberalization, at least, from the north, northeast, and east of India to the south and west of India. I don't need to tell you about your fellow state comrades who are shamefully, in my view, called migrant labor when they move to other parts of this country. Basically, if you don't earn Neelkanth's, CTC, then Neelkanth can be a Bombayite, but you drop his CTC by half, he becomes a UPite or a Bihari or something like that. Now, I'm a migrant. I'm a 4th generation migrant to my state, Maharashtra. Nobody called my grandfather, who was working class, a migrant. And this is because we are not expecting those people to be permanent residents of areas of prosperity in the West and the South. And I'm very surprised that since this country is practically run now by Western India, why this is not something that worries leaders who claim to have a national focus, but leave that aside for a minute. That's the transfer of labor. The transfer of capital that is happening, you only have to look at credit deposit ratios. Savers in the East, the Northeast, and the North transfer money to the West and the South, in the sense that for every rupee of deposit in Bihar, only 35 paise comes back as lending in Bihar. So that 65 paise is transferred to my state, to Maharashtra, or to Andhra Pradesh, or to Telangana, or to Tamil Nadu. And this is not right. So it is not as if the poorer states of India are merely facing sort of a worse situation than the richer states because they are poor. They're also facing a worse situation because they are forced to export their labor and capital to the richer states, who then make money of that labor and capital disproportionately and leave the poor states in a situation where their possibilities for transformation are limited. Now, this requires a lot of thought, but more importantly, I would submit this is a financial and economic phenomenon I'm telling you about, which it is high time, I think, the country takes cognizance of. And therefore, I would view the inverse of income distance as being a compensation for this rather unfortunate economy that we have built since liberalization. And therefore, my only submission in the context of this Finance Commission is that it should have been higher. I want to close by, I think they've done very skillfully on the population, don't get me wrong. I think we have somebody here from Bihar and we have somebody here from Andhra Pradesh, Telangana. I trust both are satisfied by the, I can assure you I did the numbers myself, a small change in that calibration that they have done of even less than a percentage point to one item or the other, one of you would have been really mad at Dr. Singh. So I would like to congratulate them, and they got it exactly right. And wow, that's what Joan Robbins used to call a knife-edge path, and they walked it. However, I want to point out two things that Neelkanth said, which are very interesting. I think the Finance Commission did the right thing, Neelkanth, in presuming that growth rates would be moderated. Because otherwise the expectations that would be raised in terms of the government's ability to spend more would have counteracted the fiscal prudence that the governments have spectacularly not displayed, not just in the pandemic, much before that, especially the central government. And again, I've told you why I have some sympathy for them. They're broke. So you can't be, it's difficult to be prudent when you're broke. And therefore, I think the moderate growth is good, because going forward, then if we do better in terms of growth than we did earlier, we could look at other things. There is also the entire question of the central government's inability, weakness, to do what it says it will do with the question of the size of the state in the role of economic activity, brought about by its muddled policy on disinvestment and privatization. Now, I hear a lot of talk this year, but I've heard it before. I'm old enough, about disinvestment and privatization. I simply do not think there is the technical capability within the central government to do this. More important, unlike other countries which have successfully privatized and successfully disinvested, the BJP government does not have a privatization champion. I mean, I'd love to be corrected by Sushil Modiji, who actually ideologically believes in the idea that the center should get out of these things. The BJP government began with the idea that the center should in fact make these things work better. I can quote you several speeches by the Prime Minister himself. So this sudden switch now, I continue to worry that it is purely for fiscal reasons. That's not a healthy thing. So given all this, in the macro fiscal picture, I think the growth projection was just right. The final point Neelkanth made is my final point, and I want to echo it. Many years ago, when I served in Brazil, my responsibility was for Latin America, and I went to Argentina, which, as you know, is a fiscal basket case, always has been. And I discovered exactly what you said, Neelkanth, that the markets were willing to lend people for home loans at 200 basis points lower than they were willing to lend the government of Argentina. If there is a storm warning in terms of fiscal crisis, since people don't seem to believe what I keep saying, that we are in a fiscal crisis, it is that when lending rates for sovereign begin to approximate, let alone exceed, lending rates for non-sovereign, that reflects a crisis of confidence in the ability of the sovereign to spend the money it is borrowing in ways that would justify investments at sovereign rates, and also fears of sovereign, therefore, misdemeanor and default. And I think all finance ministers in this country, not just Mrs. Sitaraman, would do very well to take account of this storm warning and urgently come together to address it. Thank you.
Thank you, Rathin. Before I hand over back to Dr. Singh to respond, two things. One, I just wanted to highlight a couple of questions that have come up from the audience, and then request Sushil Modiji and Reddy ji to offer their remarks, and Mr. Neelkanth Mishra as well, if you would like to come in with any closing points before Dr. Singh responds. So a few questions that have emerged. One sort of cluster of these are around the Finance Commission grants to local bodies as well as to centrally sponsored scheme, and the sort of pulls and pressures of centrally sponsored schemes that you referred to. One question is, given the it says, I'll quote it because I think it's an interesting one. Too many GOI ministries have been given authority to administer fiscal transfers to urban local bodies. Does this make the Finance Commission grants yet another centrally sponsored scheme? And a related question around the rationalization of centrally sponsored schemes, which again has been something that has incrementally been pushed by finance commissions, and the 15th Finance Commission lays this out as well. But we're still in a position where we have umbrella schemes that are essentially a nice little budgeting exercise to club all the 130 odd schemes together into 28 umbrella schemes. So any thoughts on how we can move that forward? We then have a couple of questions around the FRBM. So your views on the revision of the FRBM. Does it make the FRBM institutionally ineffective in maintaining government performance of benchmarks when it's with constantly moving targets? And also on Mr. Neelkanth Mishra's point on tax GDP ratios, what role has the 15th Finance Commission played in setting the direction to increase the tax GDP ratios from the current level? So these are some of the questions that are coming in from the audience. I'll now hand over to Sushil Kumar Modi ji for any last comments basis what he's heard, and then to the other panelists.
Yamini, I remember that after 14th Finance Commission, when they recommended devolution from 32 to 42%, a committee under chairmanship of Mr. Shivraj Singh Chauhan, it was constituted to rationalize the centrally sponsored schemes. And during and that committee recommended the change the funding pattern, because the overall transfer was not more than 49%. Yeah. Mr. N.K. Singh in his report is also mentioned, right from 11 to 15th Finance Commission. So the overall transfer, including CSS, devolution, and the FC grants, it is, for the last two finance committees, about 49%. And they have kept it even in 15th also, they have kept it 14%. Number of schemes which don't have any allocations, hardly 20 crore, 50 crore, and the states are not being able to utilize those grants, and those schemes are of no use. So I think that what Mr. Singh has recommended in his report, that the rationalizing of centrally sponsored schemes, and I think that in the coming days, central government will constitute a committee, and the number of schemes should come down, and only the important schemes, and you can merge many of the schemes. So we were demanding for the last 10-15 years, but still the number has come down, but again the schemes number increases. So number one, regarding this, then FRBM Act, और मैं ये कहना चाहूँगा कि the 12th Finance Commission, I became Finance Minister in 2005, and prior to that, the 12th Finance Commission report came into the public. And for the first time, FRBM Act was enacted in 2005 or 6, and that improved the finances of all the state governments of this country. And I think that the states have followed more the FRBM than the union government. इसलिए मुझे लगता है कि जो recommend किया है N.K. Singh साहब ने कि high-powered intergovernmental group can craft a new FRBM framework and see its implementation. So I think it is very important, and I thank Mr. Singh for recommending that normal limit for net borrowing to 4% in 21-22. तो इसलिए मुझे लगता है कि another recommendation regarding credit rating of states' financial position. So this is also a very important recommendation. तो इसलिए मैं उम्मीद करता हूँ कि centrally sponsored schemes numbers will come down in the coming years, and whatever schemes are there, they will get more and more allocation, and the burden should not be transferred to the states. Because earlier the funding pattern was 75-25, 70-30, and now in many of the schemes it has become 50-50. And many of the state governments are not able to provide their matching grant because it is a huge amount. So I would request the union government also that whichever committee is being constituted, the funding pattern should also be kept in mind, that the state should not be burdened. Thank you.
Thank you, Modi ji. But in fact, there's a very important tension there. I remember, when the 14th Finance Commission report came out, and the Chief Minister's subcommittee set up for rationalizing and reworking the dynamics of centrally sponsored schemes, there was, Reddy ji, also an argument from states, which was in Hindi we say ek haath se liya, dusre haath se diya. Ek haath se diya, dusre haath se liya, took from one hand, gave from the other, because of this shift in the change in ratios, but also a sense that what the centrally sponsored schemes did do was to, in some ways, ring fence expenditure on key social spending and national priorities, which enables states to move in that direction. So it seemed like there is this important tension here in how we think about the dynamic of fiscal federalism. Your views on that, and of course, anything else to you for last comments.
answer your question.
You're on mute, I'm sorry.
Am I audible now? Before I answer this question, with regard to the FRBM, I would like to put forth my view. Normally, FRBM pertains to two important issues. One is the amount of money you are permitted to borrow with respect to your GSDP or GDP, and then the amount of state guarantee that can be given, that again with respect to your revenue receipts and your GST is a cap. But then I would like to make a suggestion. Now, in Gram Panchayats, the smallest level of administration, there generally, at least in my state, is a rule that says your revenue expenditure cannot be more than your revenue. So I think the same logic has to be applied to the states and the state. There has to be some sort of a relation between the revenue receipts and the revenue expenditure, and also a relation between the capital receipts and the capital expenditure. Otherwise, what is likely to happen is capital receipts could go towards revenue expenditure. The minute you introduce this rule where your revenue expenditure cannot cross a percentage of your revenue receipts, it is bound to make the states and the center to cap their revenue expenditure at some point or other. Similarly, when you borrow money, when it is spent only on asset creation, automatically it results in asset creation. So this, I think, if it can be formulated or designed in such a way that it can be incorporated as an additionality to the FRBM Act, this I think will bring about a lot of change. Where the other questions, like for example, Dr. Rathin had said, like in Brazil, where your lending rates of housing loans are lesser than the sovereign. So this again is a result of the borrowers not spending that money mainly on asset creation, as well as the existing debt and the capacity to repay being in question. One other issue mentioned by Mr. Neelkanth Mishra also was the stagnant tax to GDP. So taxation rates in this country, as well as because now it's almost country, the state doesn't have any other than petroleum and excise. But we have some sort of a base or an idea or benchmark when compared to various other economies. But then in this country, I feel various places where the revenues are not coming either in the form of a tax or in the form of a service is areas like power, transport, utilities. These are the places where we're undercharged. So when these are undercharged, automatically the revenue expenditure of the states and center are going to go much high in order to take care of these issues. Therefore, I think apart from the taxation, we have to have a look at the charges of power, the charges of water, the charges of transport, etc. These are important. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Mishra, any, would you like to come in at this point?
Yeah, so I think to add on to what Mr. Reddy just said, and I totally agree that I think the innovation in taxation, because taxation beyond the more conventional, I mean, the fact that personal income tax didn't exist more or less till 100 years back or 200 years back, it was all indirect taxes and taxes and customs. So innovation has to be by definition political. Look, I am going to charge, say, for autos, slightly more for autos, and that money is going to be spent somewhere. So that political conviction at this level, the innovation at the state level, is I think what may actually help a lot, because I think this will not happen at the central level. We have seen many policies being designed at like midday meals, the Biju Har Ghar Yojana, which became the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, the Telangana Bhagirath, which became the Nal Se Har Jal, Nal Se Jal. So So we need, I think, innovation at the state level, which we haven't seen in the last 20, 30 years. And perhaps fiscal stresses will allow that innovation to happen for a creative politician to create these things and create new types of taxes and new income sources.
Thank you, Dr. Roy. And if I actually, Mr. Mishra's last point links to a question that has come, which I'll just quickly pose for both you and then Dr. Singh to reflect on, which is, whether revenue gaps will force states to move on power sector reforms and other and municipal reforms that have been issues of challenge. So really, actually, at the heart of the question, I think, of the center-state fiscal dynamic is this question of what does it take to push reforms and for states to move in particular directions, and what is the role of the center in that context? Over to you, Dr. Roy, and then I'll hand over to Dr. Singh for closing remarks.
Let me first say that on power sector reforms, I take Mahatma Gandhi's view on Western civilization, and I think Dr. Singh might have some sympathy, which is it would be a very good idea. Nothing more to be said about it. Municipal reforms will not happen because municipalities are essentially places where state governments are able to exercise huge amounts of political power and financial muscle. I'm from Bombay, so I know what I'm talking about. And therefore, it is in no one's interest that the municipal commissioner report to the mayor and not to the chief minister. As simple as that. Okay, on taxation, I want to say there's one, or just very short. I think I agree with everything that Neelkanth said. One suggestion, which is interesting, and one basic fact. You see, I think we all agree that India is far more prosperous today in 2021 than it was in 1992, even after the pandemic, before the pandemic. But our tax GDP ratio has not gone up. What does that mean? You can't tax poverty, but poverty has reduced and prosperity has increased. That means you are not able to get the share of your taxes in this increased prosperity that you otherwise ought to have rightfully expected to get. And why is that? That is because this rise in prosperity has been profoundly unequal and unequalizing. Inequality is the biggest burden, is the biggest constraint to tax buoyancy. In the country where I'm about to start working, the income tax kicks in at 10% below the per capita income, below. In my country, if I tax people even at double the per capita income, it would be a terrible thing to do in human terms, right? That's the difference in terms of tax capacity. So until we can, so I'm going to give you an example. Suppose I give you a second proposal, and then I'll stop, Yamini, which is, let us have a minimum income tax imposed by the center. And then let's the states decide how much additional income tax to impose at the state level. This will not work because we are spatially inequitable. Because then immediately you're kicking Bihar and UP in the teeth, because they simply do not have enough prosperity to impose a relatively high income tax. They don't have the money to be able to spend money commensurate with their needs, and therefore the best system for them is a national income tax, right? So whichever way you look at it, particularly in the last 25 years, because we've had huge amounts of prosperity with very little equity, we are facing fiscal burdens. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Singh, over to you to respond, and any last comments.
Well, Yamini, I'll be very brief because I think that a number of important issues have been raised by all the panelists. I'm grateful to Neelkanth, grateful to Rathin, both of whom I have had the privilege to work with somewhat closely in multiple responsibilities which were assigned to me. So let me address a couple of questions and then take up just a couple of questions from the audience. First, I think that Rathin, thank you very much for all your generous comments coming from you. And I, having worked with you closely, know the degree of due diligence which you do before you come at any conclusion, and therefore your generous endorsement of the way in which the complexities of an unusual terms of reference which we have sought to address is indeed something which comes to me in a very heartwarming, pleasant way. And I'm grateful to you, Rathin, for your exceedingly generous words which you have used. Let me make few comments. As usual, Rathin, you come up with innovative ideas. That's good, because that is what I saw this every day on a way of a moving target in the FRBM committee. So you say one on cess and surcharge, which was your first exceedingly innovative idea, that could we not have pegged the vertical on as linked to the extent of cess and surcharge and fix the ceiling on the cess and surcharge? Well, technically, it was perhaps possible. And let me also say that internally, the issue of giving a range on the vertical as a moving thing for the 5 years was debated. It's possible, but Rathin, I think this will not be practical. It cannot be a cat and mouse game that the basic intention of the Constitution is defeated. I think that we need to take the bull by the horn. I realize that they will continue to play around with this, but I think therefore we need to do this transparently on the issue of cess and surcharge. And I'm glad, Yamini, that you are beginning that public discourse by treating today's interventions as the beginning of a process by which we can reach some consensus on the issue. So yes, vertical range is possible, but impractical. It undercuts the exact philosophy which I found was echoed in the remarks of Sushil ji and also in the remarks of Conrad, that predictability and certainty were at the core of the Finance Commission's recommendation. And that therefore, if we had done, maybe in the interest of the state itself, this calibrating the vertical based on a certain new performance criteria, that if you do not peg and contain your cess and surcharge, this threshold, you suffer by way of the. I do not know whether it was capable of being implemented in a manner which would not have been disorderly and inject new components of instability. But your suggestion triggers the need for important debate. I think you used a beautiful expression, Rathin, caught by that in an era of asymmetric powers, when it comes to cess and surcharge, I think that is very well put. And I think that we need to begin by addressing how to bring symmetry in a current milieu of asymmetric powers. So that is what is really, I think, your end objective. On the issue of FRBM and the shrinking space of the central government, and the fact that tax to GDP has remained stagnant, moreover, I couldn't agree with you more. And what is the path forward? Now, one of the commentators who asked a question to you, Yamini, said that FRBM had been ineffective. Rathin, tickle your memory that did we not debate the modalities of enforcement of the FRBM very, very rigorously in the FRBM committee itself? And we concluded that beyond the sovereign taking parliamentary approval, there is nothing more to it that could be done. Why? Because you recall, Rathin, that one of the presentations that was made to us by the finance minister of Brazil, or who was a managing director also of the World Bank, and they had made a presentation, is that, I don't know in your country, he said, but in my country, if you breach the FRBM target, the president had to resign or was impeached. So I said that was a different world. I don't think that the impeachment of any government is possible because you break the targets stipulated in the FRBM committee. But I think that a time may have come to consider more meaningful ways of making the government responsible on the FRBM. So I think that both Neelkanth and you, Rathin, joined hands when we made that one recommendation in the committee which has not been accepted, and which I have reiterated on the Finance Commission, the need for a fiscal council. You do not have an institution in this country that deals with fiscal issues. I'm glad that Dr. Reddy also mentioned about one of my recommendations in the Finance Commission of some kind of a fiscal entity in each state. This will be of enormous value to you, Dr. Reddy, and to finance ministers of different state governments. So I think that we need to build fiscal institutions if you wish to encourage more informed decision making by the sovereign. And that is why the proposal which has been endorsed very much by Sushil ji of setting up an intergovernmental. Why do I call it intergovernmental? Because you remember, Rathin and Neelkanth, that when we were dealing with the FRBM, we recognized that it left the states out. It left the states out. We got out of that conundrum by saying, this the Finance Commission will take up. Yes, the Finance Commission was willing to take up, but look at the situation through which we have passed on the economic uncertainties and the ensuing uncertainties. Now, we have given a possible indicative debt path in our report. As it is, Neelkanth, you have rightly pointed out that since we did not pretend to be astrologers, we did at that time what our best judgment suggested. And in the best judgment which suggested, it looked as though that the terminal year in the combined debt of the central government moving from about 90%, 89.8%, it would slope down. And you remember we had talked about it in the earlier deliberations, that when it comes to debt, it is the direction of the needle which is more important than what the absolute debt numbers are, because you can debate till the cows come home on what those optimum debt numbers are for a country of India's size and given its per capita income and the fact that we are at best at the bottom of the middle income country. And if we had agreed on 60% ideal, we are really already close to around 89.8%. And that's the best that we could do. I agree with you, Neelkanth, that it will be idle to pretend to see any sharp movement there. But we have ended our trajectory by suggesting that we end with 85.7% at the end of our award period, which is a downward direction on the debt. Strangely and not surprisingly, the central government has chosen to accept the fiscal path for the states, in which we have given the states also a range. I better talk about that range a bit. And the fact that as far as they themselves are concerned, the central government, they have, whereas in the terminal year, I had projected a 4. They preferred in their interim report given to Parliament on the medium-term fiscal consolidation roadmap, have preferred to end in the medium term, not the 5 years, at 4.5. So a 0.5% extra latitude, a bit asymmetric, but nonetheless. Now, not only did we give this time an extra room of 1% for the states of 3 instead of 3 or 4%, but exactly to address the issue they raised by Mr. Reddy and Neelkanth, Rathin, etc. And Sushil knows this, that the one giant elephant which was available in every room in my visit to 28 states, that silent elephant was the dues of the power distribution companies and the pathetic performance of the power distribution companies going through every form of financial engineering. Rathin pointed out that I should point out a little. Yes, it is true Rathin knows that I was behind the APDP, the first effort, accelerated development, power development. I was behind the APDRP1, APDRP2. I left at that. Uday is nothing but turned out to be a version of that. So what are the instruments that we have? We explored various instruments. I must say that the power minister strongly suggested that why don't we have an automatic debit mechanism with the RBI, that it will debit the stuff. I discussed this with both Urjit and then with Shakti. We came to the conclusion that this would be very difficult by way of implementation and an automatic debit to the states. So we did, instead of penalty, we did by way of an incentive by giving an extra 0.5%. So in addition to 3 to 4, we have given an extra 0.5% contingent on some power sector reforms, which addresses the issue of the unpaid liabilities of the power distribution companies. And I think that the many states who are already in that process may like to avail of this extra incentives which we have given. Rathin, you mentioned about the issues of the outward migration of not only labor, but of capital, and alluded to something very dear to the heart of the eastern states of India, the virtual collapse or the static nature of the credit deposit ratio in terms of that is a reality. But that was not an issue which we could have addressed. It's a wider issue of how to bring about greater regional convergence instead of this base at not only the skewed up income inequality issues, but the skewed up regional equality issues, and how do you need to address that? It's a much wider issue, but the issue of migration we have taken a note of somewhat in the Finance Commission. This is the first time, because the fact that when we're addressing the issue of the pandemic, we could not ignore the issue of the migrants. We have made some suggestions on the issue of migrants as well. I think that the issue of the broader reforms of our taxation. So, Rathin, you would have perhaps seen, and Sushilji would have perhaps seen, that our Finance Commission's recommendation, like perhaps in the past also, has a pretty robust chapter on resource. And some of these laments on stagnant tax GDP ratio and what we need to do, we have made some suggestions, and Dr. Reddy alluded to this, that on the GST particularly, some of the things which I mentioned to the GST Council was not exact music to their ears. If you remember, Dr. Reddy, that many finance ministers were quite hesitant in accepting the path that I was suggesting, which I have detailed here, that fundamental reforms of GST, which goes beyond processes and procedures, and improvement of the technology platform, which have begun to yield some gainful results. But going beyond that, going to the drawing board of recalibrating rates and so on. So Sushilji would know this exceedingly well, being such an active participant in the successive meetings of GST Council in his capacity as Bihar's finance minister. But the GST requires a fundamental revisit. Now, Rathin, you made the point about income tax, and a sharp contrast to the to some of the other best practices. But look at our history. All efforts in the past to bring in more people at a certain way in the tax net has resulted in the expectations for every budget raising the threshold, or more people go out of the tax net than people who come.
Yeah.
So the fact remains that you have exemptions, which are galore. You have clever ways of tax engineering. You leave out the agricultural sector of the economy, and therefore you are left with a very, very small base to pursue your entire direct tax policy reforms. But that is a larger issue. There were two other points, and I will stop there. One was a point that was very sharply raised, that have our grants to local bodies resulted in too much of the government of India coming into the picture. Well, look at it this way, 2 points of view, 3 points of view. First, I had an option not to give because I was not obliged to give. Enough has been said and written about state finance commissions. The burden on the states would have been high. More than that, the third tier would have been left, so to say, in the cold, while other things are beginning to happen. So this is the first thing. That option I left out. I not only took the route of giving, but there is a very, very substantial increase in the total amount of, as a percentage and more than percentage relative in absolute terms, that has gone to the third tier. I have sought to balance the untied components with the tied components. And in the tied up components, I took account of the fact that the issue of the current pandemic one thought would be to engage the local bodies, panchayats, municipal bodies, hospitals at the district level, and making sure that some resources go towards that. So I have sought to, so to say, not replicate the government of India as too many ministries, because I have also suggested that apart from this, no ministry should issue any additional directions, because you remember, Yamini, who knows it better than you, that when you made that the Panchayat ministry decided on their own to come up with conditions which were far beyond what the Finance Commission had laid down. So we have sought to really try and foreclose that possibility. The final point I'd like to make about rationalization of the centrally sponsored schemes. I think the Sushil very rightly pointed out that this committee under Shiraj Chauhan was exactly designed to do that. But instead of doing that, it did come up with 8 umbrella, but within that umbrella, almost every conceivable centrally sponsored schemes continue to exist and continue to flourish. And Sushilji is absolutely right that many of this with minuscule amounts of money and resources which has gone into this. So what we did was we now two changes have taken place. Now all of us know that the earlier life cycle of all centrally sponsored schemes was coterminous with the life cycle of every 5-year plan. That with the abolition of the Planning Commission, that was substituted, that the life cycle of every centrally sponsored scheme is coterminous with the life cycle of every Finance Commission, right? So the Finance Commission had an important obligation and has an important obligation on the centrally sponsored schemes, which is therefore made coterminous. But there are, so we engaged very intensively with the Department of Expenditure, with the different ministries. There are centrally sponsored schemes, which was correctly pointed out, which have very small sums of money, and the bureaucratic expenditure and the hassles is just not worth it. We have made far-reaching recommendations on minimum threshold for centrally sponsored schemes to exist. And these have found substantive support in the Department of Expenditure. So when the finance minister made that statement in Parliament, that based on the recommendations of the 15th Finance Commission, the rationalization process of the centrally sponsored schemes is deeply underway. This statement embeds that there have been numerous consultations to and fro between the Department of Expenditure and between the Finance Commission. And hopefully, over the coming months, we will see much greater clarity on centrally sponsored schemes and on central outlays, because there are overlap areas. Now, Rathin made an exceedingly interesting point, with which I want to end. Rathin, you put it rather well, that in a country of this kind, which has moved away from a strict Westminster model, not a de jure, but a de facto, increasingly at the state level through powerful chief ministers, and at the central level by powerful prime ministers, away from the Westminster model to a more presidential model. It could not be highlighted more than the example, Rathin, which you gave. The example, would it be appropriate for a prime minister to say that you may be passing through a tremendous drought and you may be in terrible need of drinking water supply? But as far as I'm concerned, I'm going to answer your question. The foreign policy has done exceedingly well. Our defense expenditure looks exceedingly robust, because that takes you to another thing which I have been harping upon. I want to do with the future of India's federation. Please revisit Article 282 and the 7th schedule of the Constitution. That 7th schedule of the Constitution has been deeply mired in the complication of standalone parliamentary entitlements and the nature of the centrally sponsored schemes. We need to take all the three together: the scheme, centrally sponsored schemes, standalone legislations, and look at this in conjunction with the use of Article 282 of the Constitution. But Rathin, your comments have opened that wider debate too, which I think is exceedingly central to the future of federalism in India. Thank you very much. I thought I'll stop here. Thank you. Thank you, Yamini, once again.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Singh. Thank you to all our panelists, Sushil Modi ji, Dr. Reddy ji, Mr. Mishra, Dr. Roy, for such an important conversation. I think we've really covered the ground of some of the most critical sites of contestation, I would say, for the future of fiscal federalism in India, from the challenge of the role of the relationship between the cess and the divisible pool, the challenge of the institutional architecture that we need. You talked about a fiscal commission, you talked about a fiscal council, you talked about an intergovernmental commission. I'm going to throw in the interstate council as well as a critical institutional dimension to managing these new tensions. The power sector issue, the role of reforms and the center state dynamics there. Linked to that, of course, how we look at what are national priorities, how these get translated at the state level, and most crucially, in my view, the third tier, how do we balance the need to pursue national goals with the need to ensure that local self-governments are genuinely self-governments that respond to the needs of their electorate and don't fall into the trap of being implementing agencies, which also brings attention of performance versus and conditionalities versus transfers, the GST and its implications on fiscal federalism, and the need to revisit and restructure the GST together. I think, and then your last comment about the 7th schedule as well. Together, I think fiscal federalism in India is at an important and interesting juncture, and I hope I'll say selfishly that CPR can contribute in some way through dialogues and debates like this to open up the space for more public debate on how we address these very complex issues going forward, against the backdrop, as you rightly said, Dr. Singh, of a politics that is increasingly moving from a Westminster model to a presidential model, both at the center and the states. Its dynamics are complex, but the future of India certainly rests with the states of India and how the union and the states renegotiate this relationship. Thank you all very, very much for such an important, careful, nuanced discussion. I think as researchers and academics, there's so much in here for a future research agenda. We couldn't have asked for better on a Saturday morning. Really appreciate all of you being here with us today, and look forward to a continued conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Yamini. Thank you. Thank you all the panelists. Sushil ji, namaskar. Dr. Reddy, namaskar. Thank you very much. Thanks, Rathin. Thanks, Neelkanth. Thanks, Yamini, of course.
Thank you. Goodbye.